Okay, Dan.
So I have constructive feedback and destructive feedback.
Great. I wouldn't have expected anything less.
Yeah, I'll start with the destructive, and that way I get to end on a positive note. So, the destructive is arguments like randoms don't make any sense to me, because if there is adaptive advantage in bluffing, then everybody bluffs, and what should happen is everybody should discount others' signals by virtue of the ubiquity of bluffing. In other words, the system should just adapt over time, right? Now, it doesn't have to happen within the individual lifetime, but if it is true that 94% of people think they're above average, then in situations of competition, they should think that whatever signals the other person is sending, whether those are bluffs or commitments, are being shaped by the fact that 94% of people think they're above average, right? So it seems to me that it completely undermines the strategic utility of bluffing, and similarly the strategic utility of putting yourself in a situation where it's hard to back down, and so on. So that's my destructive comment, which is I don't buy the game theoretic argument. I don't see how it plays out over generational, multi-generational time. But then my constructive comment is, well, okay, if there is some strategic utility in being overconfident, then it should be the case that that the net consequences differ across political systems, so that political systems, the more that the political system has a combination of two traits, the more it should matter, overconfidence should matter. And the one is that that individuals achieve leadership through competition, right? So if rank is entirely inherited, then being overconfident is irrelevant, basically, right? But if you're an elected official or a charismatic leader or whatever it is, then it matters a lot, right? But then how autocratic you are once you're in a position of leadership, that is how steep the power hierarchy is, should make a big difference. Because if you're in a little group of people and the charismatic individual gets to talk more than the other people, but no one follows him into battle, it doesn't make any difference that he's overconfident, right? But if you're in a fascist state where you rise into the fascist state by virtue of your overconfidence, then what happens to that state as a result of your overconfidence matters a lot. So you should see differences between situations in which people can impeach the leader, or they can dissent, or they can split off, where the benefits of being grossly overconfident as a leader disappear.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, generating predictions from this kind of thing is what it's all about, and then allows it to be tested potentially. And there's good data on regime type and incidents of war and that kind of thing. It gets a bit harder when you look at individual leadership, but great. Your destructive comment, I know exactly what you mean, and I think it's not yet well resolved. But I would say that the key thing there, I think, is uncertainty. If there is no uncertainty, then we should just not buy anyone's bluff. But if there is considerable uncertainty, so we don't know if someone is bluffing or not, then I think it does leave room for bluffs to work. Now you're right that in those experimental studies which show that 94% of people think they do above average work, it seems to suggest, well, there is an uncertainty, that we know that everyone overestimates themselves. So I think the question is, do we observe a lot of uncertainty in a given setting, and given that setting, then how does uncertainty influence it? But certainly the models seem to be indicating that uncertainty is crucial, and if you don't have uncertainty, then it just all goes away. So I think that's exactly the right question to ask. Clark?
Yeah, just following up on that, actually, I was thinking the same thing, that in the way that you present this, on some of your slides where you just have a cost-benefit ratio, being the important thing, right? I mean, that alone isn't going to generate the kind of biases that you're talking about, because then it was completely deterministic, and if there was complete information, right, then the agent would know the cost benefit.
Right.
You wouldn't have any biases. So
right.
I think we agree on that. But that leads me to think that Rob and Karthik's comments about your model are worth thinking about, because what might be making that work, and I don't know the details of the model, but it seems to me that Rob is right, that the decision rule is not a rule that's based on cost and benefits, but it's a rule that's based on probability of winning.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So that rule
Yeah.
is in the dark, as it were, about the actual payoffs of decisions, which is fine, and it may be. I mean, but it's worth thinking about whether it works because the environment structure is changing over the course of your simulations, right? Such that states are getting larger, or there's more asymmetry between the state size, or whatever it is. I don't know exactly what would drive it, but I mean, even if gains and losses are symmetric in the sense that each one loses one block of territory, as Carthy was pointing out, they may not be symmetric with respect to the probability of winning. Or
Yep.
gains of winning, let's put it that way, not the probability of winning.
Yeah.
How much you gain, how much you lose, even though it's one block.
Yeah, relative to your power.
Amounts as a function of the relative size of the
Yeah.
state, which of course is what
Right.
determines your probability of winning. So, I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting is, it could be that, I mean, there's some domain specificity in the rule in the sense that it's only taking into account some information and not other information, and that resonates. I mean, that may be a form of uncertainty, right? That this is a heuristic
Right.
that's only using some information to make its decision, and that under certain situations that heuristic could evolve. But I mean, it seems like it probably wouldn't if you have a fully deterministic world and in which the decision rule was based on a fully knowledgeable calculation about how much you stand to gain or lose on average from the choices. Right? You're not going to get biases in that world.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, if information is perfect, you know the exact deterministic probability of success and what you're going to gain from it, then you wouldn't have any overconfidence. You would have the world without war puzzles, the rational choice kind of expectation of optimal decisions. So yeah, I think uncertainty is crucial and underlies all of this. And you're right that there are different types of uncertainty. You can be uncertain about the outcome. So the conflict success function is this shape like this. So it can be very flat. It doesn't matter how powerful you are, you just may or may not win. It can be very steep, so that if I know I'm more powerful than my enemy, I'm definitely likely to win. But you're right that the cost, although they just swap one chunk of territory, if I'm already huge, why should I care about that? It's a tiny proportion of my total power, and we haven't looked at that. So I'm not sure what it would do, but my prediction, just on the hoof, would be that it introduces more uncertainty, and therefore potentially increases the potential for overconfidence to be advantageous, as long as benefits exceed costs. But yeah, and just one other thing is that uncertainty is sort of part and parcel of the EMT argument, and not just in overconfidence, but in all the other settings as well, I think. If the costs of false positive and false negative errors are asymmetric over evolutionary history, and there is uncertainty about the true outcome, then you can have adaptive false beliefs. So I think uncertainty is the key here, and maybe should be better specified.
That's really not right. I mean, if you know the probabilities and you know the costs, there's no adaptive advantage to having false beliefs. It's because maximizing expected payoff is the best you can do. And
Yeah.
the fact there's uncertainty is irrelevant. It's when you constrain the decision rule not to take the costs and benefits into account, but only be based on the probabilities of outcomes, then you've got a decision rule that isn't taking the costs into account, so you've got to fix it some other way. And one way to fix it is to change the probabilities. But it's not true that if you can have all the uncertainty you want, as long as you know the probabilities correctly.
Okay, that's what you mean. Yeah.
Selection should know,
Right.
Because it's experiencing the world over a long period of time.
Right.
So there's a difference between a rule of thumb to deal with expected payoff maximization and true. I mean, prospect theory is there's no expected payoff maximization rule that will generate change decisions in prospect theory, because LA's paradox and a bunch of other stuff. I mean, it's not consistent with expected payoff maximization.
So you're saying the uncertainty has to be in some sort of relevant, it's not just uncertainty in general about the outcome, it's uncertainty in what your payoff is likely to be.
No, what I'm saying is, if you've got the computational resources to maximize expected payoff, which you certainly could in this model, then
Okay.
a selective process that is on the same payoff scale should, expected payoff maximization should win, because it's doing the best it can.
Right.
Right. But if you force, if for some constraint, due to computational, the way the brains are designed or something, you can't do expected payoff maximization, then selection may favor having policy.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, I think actually the reviewer raised this in the response to the mathematical model, and they basically said, why isn't this just a form of risk-taking? Why can't you just have a risk profile which matches this?
Huge literature. I mean,
Right.
Decision theory, and it goes on and on about these exact issues.
Yeah. Okay. So I need to think about this more, but yeah, and I think our response was exactly what you said, which is we said, well, if this is the best strategy, how would evolution get there? And the best answer may be, because of cognitive load, you have to have a simple decision rule, and a very simple decision rule is, I'm better than average by this much. Okay. Dan.
Talked about this before, but it sort of continues to puzzle me. Your audience, political scientists, live for case studies, but as a comparative biologist, I live by understanding, what's common, what leads to trends, etc. Wouldn't it be more compelling for a political decision maker to know that, the majority of the time as a country was successful in war, they did this strategy, rather than an anecdote that says that this could work or has worked once, maybe? And why not, given that you're dealing with uncertainty, why not try to reduce that uncertainty by a more quantitative analysis of successful strategies?
Yeah,
I understand the group of people you're trying to address, but why doesn't that logic get through?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think probably the answer is they're not trained that way.
Can you train them?
And then also I would say they probably perceive their situation as unique. So even if you said, here's an analysis of the last 200 wars, this is what you should probably do, statistically speaking, I think they'd probably be more swayed by the kind of unique settings of their, and I think that applies to political science doing analyses of these things as well, typically. But it's a great question. There are examples of that. So JFK, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is said to have been very affected by Barbara Tuchman's case study of World War I. And apparently it sort of did actually influence his thinking, if not his decisions. So there's some other examples like that where it seems that they were influenced by a case, his political decision makers being influenced by a case rather than data. I'm sure it's not always true. I'm sure they do use a lot of quantitative data, but I mean, certainly in our experience, Dan and I have been involved in a couple of things in Washington trying to present evolutionary ideas to policy makers, and don't you agree that they sort of just generally don't actually,
Yeah, but I struggle with why different fields struggle with evidence-based decision making all the time.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's much more a theological question.
I spent 3 years at Princeton among humanities scholars, so even one step further removed from us, and they actually found it very strange when I would show data about anything. They would say, "Why do you want to know what the average person does?" They would, and finally one of them, explained to me the difference, and they said, what you try and do is understand what normal people are like. And what we try and do is study and examine the exceptions which show us something about human nature. So it's just a completely different approach, and obviously, trained in different ways, different sort of philosophical backgrounds. I shouldn't caricature political science too much. I would say maybe half of the political scientists in the United States do quantitative work. In Europe, it's probably a lot less. So they're not totally averse to it, and I think neither are decision makers. But it's a great question. Why aren't they more interested? Hi.
As the lone political scientist in the room, I want to, in some ways, recuse myself because I study the neuroscience of strategic assessment, and so
Awesome.
I agree with your characterizations and also sympathize. I'm very curious to find out what happens When you play with repeated interactions, Jim Fearon at Stanford has a really interesting paper on war termination under conditions of asymmetric information, and that essentially countries stop fighting when they agree with each other's assessments of their relative strength. So under these conditions of uncertainty, it seems like there's a really neat element in that, both with the boxer and the poker player analogies. You don't just have these different ways that people benefit from bluff, but there's also significant variation in their capacity to bluff.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like that's something that would be very interesting to see in a repeated interaction. Certainly the repeated games and updating is going to be interesting, but the demonstration effect, speaks to some of that. But I'm so fascinated to hear what happens when you run this with states with different levels of capabilities for being successfully persuasive in their bluffs with regard to resolve or just poker playing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. So you would allow some sort of learning, and then if someone had bluffed you before, you'd be less likely to believe it the next time. That would be a really interesting extension, and I suspect it would reduce the advantage of overconfidence, because you can no longer get away with it. There's no bluffing there, though. If I'm a state in that model, I overestimate myself, but I'm not gullible about what other people say about their own strengths. But you could certainly, add that to the model, and it would be interesting to see what happens. But I think it would reduce the advantage. Again, coming back to this thing about uncertainty.
Right, but it might go in the other direction as well. The learning effect can be, this state bluffed, and we were taken in by the bluff. However, the bluff succeeded, so there are a few different ways to go with that conclusion. So maybe when it aggregates, you get, it could go either way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's great. I will add it to the list of extensions for the next time. But thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it here. So Dominic's here for months.
Thank you.